You're listening to the Max Planck Lawcast, which showcases the academic research currently being conducted across the Max Planck Law Network. I'm your host, Christopher Murphy, and together we'll be talking to some of the more than 400 researchers who are pushing the frontiers of legal knowledge in Germany and abroad. When it comes to new and exciting legal research, the Lawcast has you covered. Welcome back to the Max Planck Lawcast. I'd say that any historian worth their salt will certainly be aware of the Assyrians, a prominent and exceedingly powerful civilization that ruled over much of ancient Mesopotamia. For over 2,000 years, the Assyrians carved out one of the largest and most significant empires in the ancient world. Yet time has not been kind to the Assyrians, as their once mighty civilization has almost completely faded from the modern worldview. That being said, a small minority of this civilization's ancestors do survive to this day, living stateless in parts of present-day Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. Though this small indigenous group is nowadays largely invisible to outsiders, the Syriacs retain a distinct ethno-religious identity, language, and culture. However, due to numerous human rights violations, many Syriacs have left their ancestral homeland and now live abroad. On today's episode, we're going to look more closely at the Syriacs to better understand the relationship between law and collective identities. To do so, I'm joined by Kadir Eryilmaz. Kadir is a researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, where he is currently completing his PhD on how small communities use the law to tackle their marginalization. Kadir, thanks for joining us today on the Lawcast.
Thank you, Chris, for having me.
Why is it that the minorities in Turkey particularly interest you, and why are we going to be talking today about one such minority, namely the Syriacs?
That's a question that I receive a lot, actually, so I prepared an answer.
Yeah, okay.
So in my former studies, I already looked at minority-relevant issues. And from legal perspective, the main framework for minorities is quite interesting. So there's a international treaty called Lausanne Treaty. So we are actually at its centenary. It was signed 100 years ago, and it basically established Turkey internationally. So we can say that it constituted modern Turkish Republic. So the second important part is it was part of one of those minority treaties after the First World War. So basically, treaty says Turkey will protect the rights of minorities. But the question is, who's minority? And according to the treaty, when you look at the text, it says only non-Muslims are minority, because when you look at the negotiation documents, the Turkish delegates did not accept Muslim minorities because they thought that if the majority of the country is from one religion, which is Islam, they cannot be minority and majority at the same time. So that logic was accepted by the other parties after long negotiations. That left Christian and Jewish groups to us to protect in the concept of minority. But when you look at domestic law, the interpretation was more restrictive. The minority rights were only applied to Greek, Armenian, and Jewish minorities in Turkey. But Turkey is a much more diverse country. So we have Alevis, we have Syriacs, we have Yazidis. These are all non-Muslim. Well, Alevi's case is a borderline case. But in general, we have clearly, undebatably non-Muslim communities such as Syriacs. But when I was looking at these blind spots that basically fall under the treaty, but not benefiting from the minority rights, I ran into Syriacs, actually. This group had an ancient history in Turkey. And now, interestingly, many of them are gone. They're now living in Europe. And they rarely come, well, not rarely, but in summers usually, they only then come to Turkey. So it was very interesting for me to see that. So my legal question turned into more socio-legal one. I framed my research question, and my basic premise was if a particular group experienced the law different than the majority, they should develop certain patterns. And for Syriacs, they were always in the sort of purgatory state. So I was wondering what kind of effects would this have on their mindset when they look at law?
Maybe though, for a bit of a general knowledge question, how many Syriacs actually, you said some come and go, but how many live permanently, if you will, in Turkey to this day?
So, as you said in the beginning, they are sort of stretched into Mesopotamian region. For Turkey, my research covers only Turkey, Syriacs from Turkey, both living in Turkey and diaspora.
Mhm.
So, for Turkey, their homeland is Mardin city. It is in eastern Turkey. In their homeland, there are around 3,000. And there is also, so to say, internal diaspora in Istanbul. So 20,000 for that, pretty much, give or take. And for diaspora, the largest community is located in Germany and Sweden. They have between 100,000 to 150,000 in each country. And
Okay.
take into other countries like Benelux countries into consideration, for example, we can say that we are talking about 300,000 people in Europe.
In Europe. Okay. And based upon what you just said, I was just kind of quickly popping some numbers into a calculator here. You said there's roughly 20,000 in Turkey at the moment, which seems to be, if Turkey, I just did the calculation, has roughly 85 million inhabitants, and there's 20,000 Syriacs that kind of come to a number here, which is 0.02%. Now, my maths isn't brilliant. That's why I'm podcasting rather than being a mathematician. But it's clear that this is an extremely small minority. How have the Syriacs managed to even survive as a culture at all?
Yeah. In fact, some of my interlocutors said they are sort of reminiscents of an ancient civilization. Some explained this with different concepts, actually. They said some of them, they're like museum artifacts, like because Mardin city is nearly 500,000 and we're talking about 3,000 people. So they are there, but they are sort of a drop in an ocean
Yes,
or
yeah, that's right.
so they know they have this lingering presence, but they're still present, although they are few.
Okay.
And I think the main factor for that is sentimental attachment to their ancestral lands. Because in my fieldwork, I have seen many cases in which the diaspora Syriacs were willing to pay legal costs for the lawyers, much more than the actual worth of their land, actually. So, although they're small, they do not extinct because since their migration to Europe, it has been nearly half a decade. But when you go to Mardin, you will see a lot of Syriacs and Syriac shops, their presence, their church. It is because they have the sentimental attachment to the region.
Okay.
And
So that's how their tenacity to and desire to stay relevant there is what has allowed them to
yes,
survive as a culture.
yeah. When you look at the numbers, we are talking about much bigger community in diaspora, and they have a strong mobilization towards the homeland, actually. Like they write petitions, they do fundraisers, they initiate legal actions, and etc. So there's a strong tendency to mobilize their resources. So that's why they have a presence, but it's lingering, like I said.
Okay. Well, before we talk a little bit about the use and the mobilization of the law, you touched on it previously, after the Treaty of Lausanne, the founding of the modern Turkish state, how have the Syriacs been treated over these ensuing decades? It sounds like in many ways they were ignored, maybe, or at least not seen as a valid minority. Is this correct?
Yeah. Well, so let's build on the Treaty of Lausanne in connection with the other question. So if we look at Lausanne, like every legal text, it's a product of its time. So when we look at the beginning of the modern republic, we're talking about a newly established state. Basically, they inherited shipwreck, so to say, from Ottoman Empire. And as we know, Ottoman Empire was a multi-ethnic and multi-religious state. And according to some, this brought the empire's own demise. So they were saying that there were many, many different nationalities. So the only solution was creating a nation state. And in the early Republican times, the elites were very much dedicated to building a nation. And this national identity was defined on being Turk, accompanied by being Muslim, actually. And in the nation building process, while the Turks, and to a certain extent, Kurdish people too, were considered as the original owners of the country. And the minorities were, on the other hand, were regarded as the external elements. And that's why I call them sort of step citizens. They're not from their own flesh and blood from the state, you know?
Okay. Do they see themselves? I mean, you obviously haven't talked to all 20,000 Syriacs who live in Turkey, but is there a general consensus? Do they see themselves as Turkish or as Syriacs, or both?
They are seeing them as Syriac for sure,
Hmm.
ethnically, but they are undeniably Turkish citizens.
Okay. Yeah.
So we are talking about in-between situation
Mhm.
because the Turkish constitution says everyone who has Turkish nationality is a Turk. So,
Okay.
but on the other hand, when you look at the minority rights they can benefit from, the situation does not seem to be like that.
Hmm. Okay. That's because they are not really viewed or haven't been viewed by the Turkish state for a long time as a valid minority with certain rights and protections.
Yes, exactly. So the laws did not target them directly. So when you look at laws, you cannot see anything directed against particularly Syriac people, but the law did not work in their favor too. So, for
Okay.
example, the state officials were telling them they're honorable members of Turkish society. For example, I just quoted this from an answer to their application to open their own school because they applied to the administrative authorities, and administrative authorities basically say, you are part of Turkish society. Why do you want your own school to teach your own language? So you're basically Turkish. And this sort of logic, I think, reveals the mindset behind the legal context because it says honorable members of Turkish society. And you immediately think that in that case, minority situation might not be so honorable.
Yes, sure.
It is not articulated in the law, but when you delve into it, you see how minorities are positioned. So minority is not seen as basically objective legal term that comes with some obligations and some rights, but a position, either negative or positive position in the society. So it's very politically loaded term.
Well, don't go away. I'll be back with Kadir after this short break.
Allow us to introduce you to the wealth of information found on the Max Planck Law website. Discover a range of events, from researcher-led presentations and reading groups to workshops and conferences, many of which are open to the public. Keep up to date with our news, explore the tangible impacts of our research, and peruse Perspectives, our online publication offering insightful articles on current legal issues. And of course, for those looking to pursue a PhD or postdoctoral research, you will find everything you need to know about our many academic opportunities. Visit our website today, law.mpg.de.
Welcome back to the Lawcast. Thanks for listening to us today. So, Kadir, how has the experience of the Syriacs, both in Turkey and abroad, affected their perception of themselves and the law?
So, one of my findings is that the tendency to use the law increases depending on the perception of legal process rather than the actual result, unlike one might expect. So result is very much important, that's for sure. But what I find is the overall experience matters. So let's make the argument more concrete. So for example, let's say I'm a Syriac villager who live in diaspora. I realized my old neighbor put fences and occupied to my land because I left my village in the 80s and I don't seem to return. So he just extended his borders to my land. And my cousin who stayed in Turkey calls me to let me know. And let's say I'm not intimidated by the tribes that in my land because obviously that neighbor turned out to be part of this influential land who work for the state. Then I go to court. First, I need to find a lawyer that can take the case who are not intimidated by the same tribe. And then I have to pay the legal fees. And then I need to be present when the judge decides to do field expeditions. And then maybe my hearings will be adjourned when I arrive to Mardin from Hamburg, let's say, and my tickets will be wasted and my case will be solved in 2 years. And guess what? New judge arrives to the case and he turned out to be sort of racist person or prejudiced person. So he makes negative remarks about my Syriac identity. In the end, I win the case, but at what cost?
Okay,
So,
right. You've been put through the ringer. You've won on legal grounds, but the experience has been unpleasant.
Yeah, furthermore, I returned to Sweden, let's say, and my fellow friends asked what happened to your case? And then I talk about my experience, my bad experience. And then they talk to their cousin in Germany. And then they talk to their cousin in Netherlands. So then the all one individual experience is circulating all the globe because they're very close-knit community.
Yes.
And then all of these experiences accumulate and turn into a factor that determines the legal behavior. So same premise can be told for smooth experiences too. So what I say is basically that we need to consider the whole experience rather than the result.
Well, Kadir, we've talked about how the Syriacs have experienced the law in Turkey. I'd now like to ask how you would say that they've experienced the law in Germany.
This sort of understanding and perception of law is called legal consciousness in the literature. And the anthropological researchers say legal consciousness is very much contextual. It depends on the country, it depends on the legal subject, or it's very much context dependent. And it's individual and collective at the same time. So for German context, my interview partners always underlined the contrast between the law in Turkey and Germany. So they believe the fairness of German law more when it comes to that. And they think that the law is something judge just apply because they have this constitutional rights, they have whatever they have, it's in the law, it's in the book. So it's not political, it's just something technical. They think that. Whereas in Turkey, we observe more skeptical approaches to the law. And therefore, the courts were seen as the last resort, prefer to solve their disputes on the ground or with the political debates or more through the mediation of influential actors. They can be tribal lords, they can be non-bureaucratical officer or politician, so on and so on.
Okay. And how would you say then that has, both in Turkey, the experience, as well as abroad, affected the Syriacs' identity and acceptance of the judicial system?
I think for Turkey, it created a dependency to political context because we had this minority turn in Turkey in early 2000s because we were talking still accession period to EU. But after 2013, the regime started to get more autocratical. The democratic checks and balances were eroded.
Mm-hmm.
And now we ended up in hyper-centralist presidential system. So until now, my answer seems like irrelevant with your question, but it is very much intertwined because this sort of change created a dependency of good relationships with the political power. So, for example, the backsliding that I just talked about did not cause minorities to lose their rights. Yes, human rights are much worse in Turkey right now, but minority rights, cultural rights are two different things. For example, they can teach their native language, they can open their church, but they cannot freely express their political criticism. So, coming back to your question, Syriacs experienced this narrowing political field. On the one hand, they were giving some rights, but since they are granted with the special laws and special decrees or presidential decrees, they can be taken immediately whenever the president or the assigned committee decides. They can be taken by the simpler circular. And in the end, this sort of legal change affects the behavior. In thesis, I call this performative loyalty, because if you are a vulnerable group, you need to prove that at least you are loyal.
Well, before the show, Kadir, you told me that you yourself are not a Syriac. I'd therefore like to ask whether it was difficult for you as an outsider, if you will, to establish a rapport with members of the Syriac community.
Yes, it was very much hard, actually, if I have to. But if you do an ethnographical fieldwork, you have a lot of time to build that rapport. It took me months until I get my first interview, actually. And it was sort of frustrating because I consider myself an introverted person. And all the introverted listeners probably would have an extroverted friend who introduced them to other people. And you need to stick to that person, which I did in the fieldwork. So I basically reached to people who believed my research. And then who are respected enough in the community that can introduce me to other people. So basically, they were the gatekeepers of the community. And once I gained their trust, because I don't know how many times I told them my ethical responsibilities and the data and how the data will be used. But in the end, without the trust of that particular person, you cannot work with these vulnerable groups because of all of these bad experiences I talked about until now. They are really reserved and shy, understandably. And I'm ethnically Turkish from Ankara. And Ankara is the center of administration.
Yes.
And also the intelligence service. So I was considered as the spy that is sent by, I don't know, Ministry of Foreign Affairs or Central Intelligence Service. So basically, I started one step behind in every conversation. But I think overall, it's like friendship. You need to invest and you need to show that you're genuine. I think that opens many doors. Yeah, I'm looking forward to publish my thesis as a book and send them and wait for them to identify themselves and their quotes. And yeah, because I think it's important to give back to the community as well, because it can turn into taking all the time, but not giving back to the community. I think that would at least help them in some way. At least they would feel that they were heard. But I don't know how much else I can do, but that's my...
Yeah, that's what's within your powers. That's right, exactly. So from ancient empire to a stateless people, I mean, the history of the Syriacs, we've only touched on it today, but it's obviously without doubt rich and diverse. Based upon everything you've done, your ethnological research, your discussions, your understanding of the law in Turkey, would you say that the Syriacs, and you have to tell me in probably 10 words or less, but have the legal and political tools to preserve their heritage?
Like many questions, the answer of this question is also yes and no. I think they are quite active for such a small group, but also for the same reason, their effect is limited. And I think it is up for us, the legal professionals or academics, to protect the individuals who don't have the means, because that's the point of human rights, no? And I think my research can contribute to that. At least I'm hoping that the policies can be drawn to improve the situation. And I think we have the shared responsibilities, like Syriacs will defend their own rights in their own means. But also I think people working with the minorities or vulnerable groups should share the responsibility. So it's like a finish, like a TED Talk, but I think it's a hopeful end.
Yeah.
I hope.
Okay, certainly. Well, that's very much a good way to end our podcast on, Kadir. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights. Good luck with the defense of the dissertation and the publication, and good on you for fighting the good fight.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Lawcast. If you'd like more information about Max Planck Law, or if you'd like to get involved, please visit us at law.mpg.de.
Max Planck Law. Excellence in legal research.